Hello, everyone. This is Nayiri from Low Carb and Fasting. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the channel, you know that I invite physicians, nutritionists, researchers, authors, athletes to the channel and other inspirational people. But it's rare to find people who combine several qualities together. So today's guest is not only inspirational, but you will love her. She's the most agreeable character I've ever met on social media. She's a licensed dietitian, RD registered dietitian in the US. She's the author of The Dietitian's Dilemma, which is also an endurance athlete. Michelle Hurn, welcome to Low Carb and Fasting.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the introduction.
Michelle, I think, where do I start? You really are inspirational. I've been looking at some of your videos as well. So I have a lot to cover today, but why don't we start? Well, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit more to our audience who may not have heard of you by telling them about your athletic feats, or at least some of them. They're worth a mention. The stage is yours.
Well, I appreciate that. I'll give just a little background of who I am, my health journey, and what I do now. So, my health story really starts when I was 12 years old. I was diagnosed with anorexia. I was about 5 feet tall and 57.5 pounds. So, I was immediately put into inpatient treatment, given about a 10% chance to survive. And, given the standard American guidelines, put on 24-hour tube feeding. At the age of 12, I was on, 7 different medications for GI, kidney issues, anxiety, depression, and I was just told, this is going to be your lot in life. It's like, if you survive this, you're always going to have anxiety. You're always going to have racing thoughts around food. So as a teenager, obviously I did become weight restored, but I just decided, like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to become this very high functioning human with all these problems. And it was accurate. I struggled with anxiety and depression throughout my teenage and adolescence, certainly into my early adulthood. I did become weight restored. I became an athlete. I really wanted to figure out what was going on in my body, and how could I potentially, I've been very, too thin, and I was weight restored, and I knew nutrition was powerful, and so I wanted to become a dietitian. I thought, if I can just learn more about food, I can help other people. And so I became a dietitian, in 2009. But, when I entered the internship, to be a dietitian, you get your 4-year degree, you do an internship, then you sit for the exam. I just saw things that didn't make sense. Like, for example, we would go into a room with a patient with type 2 diabetes. And, that my preceptor would say, okay, we're going to teach this patient to have 75 carbohydrates at breakfast, 15 at snacks, 75 at lunch. And I was like, oh, wait. Isn't their blood sugar high? Like, shouldn't we reduce their carbs? Oh, no, Michelle, everybody needs lots of carbs. They're important for your health, So I just, once again, that you're a student, you're like, oh, okay, I must be missing something. Then we'd go into a room like the ICU. I'll never forget my first time in the ICU. I flipped over the tube feeding and I was like, oh my God, this is the same stuff I was fed as a 12-year-old. And I just posed the question, like, is this the best way to feed somebody who's been in a traumatic accident? If you're getting tube fed, you either need a lot more calories or often you're not able to eat at all. And the number one ingredients of tube feeding formulas are corn syrup solids, canola oil, and maltodextrin, as well as soy protein. And, I was just, oh, Michelle, it's all about calories. Don't worry about it. I was kind of pegged as this difficult student. Like, why does she keep asking all these questions? And, when I became a dietitian, I saw cycles of sickness. I had a patient list a mile long. I had not enough time to talk to anybody. And even people who were following the guidelines or said they were following the guidelines just kept getting sicker and worse. Diabetics, A1C increasing, amputations, heart failure, chronic kidney disease, stage 1, going into stage 2, stage 3, ultimately ending up on dialysis. Patients younger than me, in their 30s, having heart failure. And it was hard. I was discouraged. But, honestly, it wasn't until I lost my own health in 2019 that I made a dramatic switch. And that's kind of what kicked off the journey for the book and my latest athletic endeavors.
So, and I'm not defending what they put in the tube, but it did restore your weight. Was it then, can we say it was an effective treatment to just tube feed you, which is another form of force feeding you, so your weight would be restored? And is that an intervention that's permanent for people who have anorexia? Because I know some of the people that I coach, not some, but very few of them, have children who've been diagnosed with anorexia, and they're just completely lost, and it's a tough one, and they don't know how to help their children.
That's a great question. And I've done a presentation. I'll be doing another one on eating disorders. Anorexia has the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric disorder. That means more people will die of anorexia than bipolar disorder, depression, generalized anxiety disorder, schizophrenia. For females ages 15 to 24, their chance of dying from anorexia is 12 times higher than anything else. Sickness, accidents, alcohol overdose. The relapse rate, here's a take-home thing. The relapse rate of anorexia is 50%. 20% of people with anorexia don't die from the complications, they actually end their own lives. And 20 more percent, if you don't end your own life, 20% of people end up chronically in and out of hospitals. So to answer your question, will it weight restore you? Absolutely. I was weight restored. But is it a long-term recovery solution? No, it's not. I would argue, and I will present if anybody in the US, I'm going to be at KetoCon, I'll be at Low Carb USA in August. There is a much better way to feed people, because the current nutrition guidelines, and that's pretty much what's in tube feeding formula, right? Just lots of sugar and some, inflammatory fats and proteins. While that will make you gain weight, and that potentially what that does to the neurotransmitters in your brain, as well as, potentially harming your intestinal epithelium. In my opinion, experience, and our clinical data, I think, is showing that can lead to long-term complications, relapse, and death.
So it's not an effective way to just restore the weight, and it's not an effective long-term measure. Would
Exactly.
you say that anorexic patients then, especially when they're young, teenagers, would then at some point have a relapse? Is that what happened to you?
Oh, I've relapsed. I've relapsed several times. Absolutely. Not so necessarily where I would need the DSM-5 to go back into treatment, but when we're saying relapse, lost quite a bit of weight, restrictive behaviors. Absolutely. Yes. Because what's happening often in treatment is they're getting tube fed, they're getting fed the standard American diet, they're potentially gaining weight. And they're giving, you're getting therapy, you're getting all these tools. But it's kind of like that saying, goes in one ear out the other. If you're not being nourished in a way where your body can actually absorb the nutrition, because anorexia, your GI system is damaged. You can't absorb food if you've starved yourself for several months. It's crazy. We don't address this. And we're feeding people the sugars and the flours. They're not absorbing nutrition. Their brain isn't functioning. We're potentially altering some of the neurotransmitters in your brain with that very, very highly processed diet. You're just basically setting yourself up for relapse. Another thing, we actually have clinical trials. When you lose a lot of weight, and this is specifically in anorexia, the gray matter of their brain shrinks. That makes sense, right? When you become weight restored, the gray matter, it regenerates. The human body, that's another message to people, is, man, your human body is resilient. It really wants to be well. The gray matter can actually get restored. But what if all the fats and those things that you rebuilt your brain on are inflammatory? You just restored your brain with canola oil. Like, how well is that going to function in synapse? So yes, I will argue that our current treatments are basically, while they may initially save your life, my life certainly was saved by a standard American diet and tube feeding. I was plagued with, my goodness, decades of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation. I have permanent scarring on my wrist from self-injuries. So, my question to health professionals is there a better way? And obviously I believe there is.
So as a dietitian, you would have been classically trained on the sort of calories in and calories out model, and avoid saturated fats, and carbs are your friend. And for diabetics, take insulin. Sorry, that just sums it up.
You nailed it. You nailed it.
So that's how you were trained. At what point did you stand back and question everything and change your approach?
Yeah, like I said earlier, I definitely questioned things initially because once again, this is something that I call all health professionals, is I think we're really missing two things in the health, nutrition, doctor, everybody. We're missing a little bit of common sense. We're letting, these guidelines override our common sense, and we're missing courage, once to stand up against, once you see it, you certainly can't unsee it. But yeah, in 2019, I was trying to qualify for the Olympic trials in the marathon. I was a marathon runner, qualified for Boston 13 times. You have to run, they've changed the standard, but back then you had to run under 2 hours and 48 minutes as a woman. I had run 2 hours and 54 minutes. So I was training really hard. I had started working at a new hospital in Portland, and my body just stopped recovering. Like, I would go on runs and I was achy. I was getting cold sweats, and it was very unusual, so I thought, like, oh man, is something wrong with my labs? Get my labs checked. Everything's fine. He reached out to a few dietitian friends, and they just said, oh, you're not eating enough carbohydrates. At that time, I was eating 350 grams. Oh, you need more, Michelle, 400, 500. As you can imagine, I'm very driven. I'm like, all right, I can do this. That made things worse. My anxiety went from bad to panic attacks. And the final straw was, this had been going on for about a month. I actually had a couple times I'd go out for a run and I would literally break out in a cold sweat. Like, it was very bad. But I had a particularly difficult day at the hospital. I'd often cover oncology. We had a patient pass, came home early, fell asleep, woke up, and it just felt like my body was on fire. Like, everything hurt. And I remember standing in my kitchen. It was like 2 a.m. I'm like, what do I do? I don't know. I was out of options. I had tried, you name it, I'd tried it, and so I decided at 2 a.m. I was going to, drove to 7-Eleven, got 30 pounds of ice, put it in the bathtub, and just was sitting in ice, trying to just kill some of the pain. And that's when my wife came in, tried to be quiet, woke her up with the ice banging, and, just took my hand and said, hey, you know what? Maybe we should try something different. And I cried. I said, I'm done. I'm done running. At that point, I'd been running, 22 years. I said, I'm done. I'm too old to try to compete. I am miserable. I didn't like my job. I felt like I wasn't helping anybody get better. I was being short with my wife. My anxiety was through the roof. My body hurt. And so, I decided, I had no idea. If you had told me at that moment that this low point is going to be the starting point of some of the greatest things that could possibly happen to you, I wouldn't have believed you, but I'm very grateful.
Yeah, I had a low moment like that when I was a carb eater. And it was probably, if I had to pinpoint one moment that changed my approach, that triggered me to change my outlook, was probably that moment. I was a carb eater according to Diabetes UK sort of guidelines, and match your insulin to your carb intake. If you're new to my channel, I'm type 1 diabetic now for 44 years. So I remember the dietitian specialized in diabetes. So every diabetes clinic had a diabetes specialized dietitian. And the dietitian was frustrated with me because no matter what I did, my HbA1c was not coming down. It wouldn't come down. And she said to me, do you know how privileged you are to have, this was pre-CGM, so there weren't any CGMs, but I did have a pump. So to have a pump and not be able to bring your HbA1c down, she said, use it in a smart way, use all the different options on the pump so that you're not having those blood sugar spikes. And she said a word which I've not used since. I avoid that word because it hurts. She said, Nayiri, you're intelligent. You have to be more proactive. Proactive is the word. I dread that word now. I've not used it since. I avoid that word with all my sort of might. But I was being proactive. I was using my pump options. Sort of square bolus and extended bolus and the different sort of taking my insulin sensitivity into account. I was doing everything I could. I even was cooking all my meals at home, including bread. Every morning I'd wake up and make bread for the family because we wouldn't buy the supermarket ones. They're no good. They have additives. So we were eating what I thought was a healthy diet. But no one ever told me, well, if you're not eating that pizza, have that spike.
Yeah. Well,
Me
you
that
nailed it.
I had to
You
find
nailed
it
it.
out myself. They just told me to be more smart with the pump. And I tried different options. No matter what I did, after a big fat pizza, I would have a blood sugar spike. I couldn't be clever enough to bring my blood sugars down with it. So let's talk about blood sugars, because it's interesting. You actually wore I'm not wearing my CGM on my arm now, but usually, yeah, it's on my leg. But you wore a CGM as an experiment. You're not diabetic, but you found out some interesting results, didn't you, Michelle? Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, and first I want to validate that is probably one of the biggest problems I see in healthcare right now is that, when I was in the clinic as recently as 2020, a lot of doctors and dietitians, we are taught that it is not the failure of the guidelines, that the guidelines are not the problem. It is our patients. It is your fault. You're not doing better. If you would just eat what we tell you to do, if you would just use your medications like you're supposed to, you would be fine. So I'm sorry you experienced that. Overwhelmingly in my experience, that was not the case. We blame the patients when we need to be looking at these horrific guidelines. I was really fortunate that, Dexcom sent me one just to check out stuff. And I was surprised. I'm very fat adapted. I followed now and that's kind of tying into the story. In 2019, I adopted a carnivore diet and then now do a ketovore diet, a very low carb, high fat diet. But yeah, I was surprised that certain things had a relatively high impact on my blood sugar. Somebody like myself who doesn't eat a lot of carbohydrates, the things that they tell us, like, oh, you should be eating, chicken and rice. Like that was the highest my blood sugar went. It went through the roof. My body very sensitive to some of those, you guess you'd say more refined carbohydrates, the rice, where when I would just eat things like beef and butter, it was like flatlined, and even some fruits, every fruit's good for you. Everyone should have fruit. That's what we tell our patients, things like even blueberries caused a relatively, high spike for myself. So, and obviously as an athlete, I certainly incorporate some carbohydrates into my diet, but that was really good data. It was good to know. And that's why, certainly when I'm structuring meal plans for people, I'm very, I believe our foundation should be the same for everybody. As humans, we evolved, meat and fat, mostly meat and fat, produce, any type of plants was available seasonally. They were very small. They look nothing like what we grow today, low in sugar, low in carbs. And when you follow that way of eating, much higher fat, and also saturated fat's good for you. We have no evidence that saturated fat's bad. Even the American Heart Association was like, oh shit, our bad. It's actually not, they said it much more diplomatically than that, but we have no evidence. We even have evidence that a higher LDL is certainly can be immunoprotective as long as your A1C and triglycerides are low. But so that's kind of how I believe health can be restored. And it's really amazing. I've seen a lot of people regain health, reverse diabetes, reverse heart disease. We didn't even used to think you could improve kidney function once you were in kidney failure, but I've seen several cases now, people improving their kidney function. So yeah, and that's probably the I'm always open to learning, growing, and evolving, but I've been eating this way now since late 2019, and the healthiest I've ever been. I was able to start running again. My wife thought it was just going to be fun and recreationally, but this way of eating, this high fat, low carb, animal based diet, let me start dreaming again. I would go on runs, and I would say,
not only
maybe.
For athletes, is it?
What's that?
This diet is not only for athletes, for all of us.
Everybody. I mean, I would even say, especially if your health is really failing, I think you can benefit a lot from this way of eating. I certainly think athletes, kind of depending on your sport, can benefit from some, carbohydrates you tolerate relatively well. But, I'm somebody in my high point of training runs about, 85 to 90 miles a week. And my carbohydrate intake is less than 50 grams a day most days. Obviously during race day, it's different, and during our very high intensity, but, back in, my whole life, I was a 350, 400 gram, very high carbohydrate athlete. And now I'm much, much lower, much higher in animal proteins, much higher in fats. And, everything is healed. My anxiety, and I've shared this story before on other podcasts, 3 weeks. First, my wife wasn't particularly excited about this way of eating. I struggled with eating disorder and thoughts and tendencies. for 3 weeks after starting a carnivore diet. She asked me to come sit with her, and she said, I don't know if I like this way of eating yet. So this is the best your anxiety has been in the 11 years that I've known you. That was 3 weeks, not 3 months, 3 years, 3 weeks. My brain started functioning. I was calm. I felt like I wasn't sitting on the sideline of my own life. Like I was present. I wasn't constantly hungry. I wasn't thinking about where my next meal came from. My body started healing. My legs stopped hurting. As I shared, I couldn't run 15 minutes. It got to the point where I was breaking out in cold sweats. This 2 weekends ago, I ran 100 kilometers. I ran 62 miles and won a race out here in the Gorge in Oregon. I think it was on the Washington side. I live on the border, Oregon and Washington. But like I said, your body and your brain have a tremendous capacity to heal. When you start fueling it with absorbable nutrition that humans can actually absorb, and you stop feeding it things that are just not meant for the human body.
Would you say that your athletic performance or your endurance generally improved when you reduced your carbohydrates? With
that, and but I mean, I would say I significantly increased my animal protein too. I might have, as a high carbohydrate athlete, I probably had 6 to 8 ounces of animal protein would have been a lot. I mean, now I have 1.5 pounds a day of beef or, pork or salmon. Also, I was very careful about how much fat I had. I mean, I try to keep my fat very low when I was eating a high carbohydrate diet. And now it's not uncommon for me to get, 150, so depending on the day, sometimes 200 grams of fat a day, and mostly saturated fat. I do, we do some olives and olive oil and some coconut oil, but mostly butter, tallow, fatty meats, things like that. And I mean, if you had told me 3 years ago that I would run 6 hours or 50 miles or 62 miles, just run it, I would have told you were nuts. And they said, hey, you're going to run it and you're going to run it well. I'd have been like, you're out of your mind. But like I said, I think we put limits on ourselves. I think most people just function in this state of poor health. We just think this is normal. It's normal to be hungry all the time. It's normal for my body to hurt. It's normal to be tired. It's normal to be irritable. That's not normal. 88% of our country in the US has some type of metabolic dysfunction, meaning that, most people it's prediabetes or diabetes, type 2 diabetes,
or
depression. Oh, sorry.
Resistant.
Yeah, some type of insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia. What other? Depression. Depression is the number one cause of disability in the United States. Obesity, obviously, is increasing exponentially. Actually, interestingly, I found out last year that the fastest growing demographic in the US for obese humans is children ages 2 to 5. Their demographic is increasing in obesity. So we're not doing great. But there is a solution, but it's very hard because processed foods are everywhere you go. They're heavily marketed, and dietitians, doctors, everybody is telling you to eat in this way that just is wrong. And it's really, it's interesting to me that more dietitians and doctors don't stop and say like, hey, like this isn't working. But if you do that, I couldn't practice in the hospital. I would lose my license. You are required to practice in a certain way. And what are you supposed to do? Like, if I wanted to stay in the hospital, like, let's say I needed the money or needed insurance, like I understand the dilemma. It's my book, The Dietitian's Dilemma. What do you do? My health was restored, but I couldn't keep giving information that I knew was hurting people. And so, obviously I made a plan to get out, decided to speak out, write the book, include a lot of science and testimonies. And it's my hope that, people who are suffering with eating disorders or diabetes or sarcopenia or heart disease or depression, depression is also decreasing exponentially in our young people, that they can look and they can say, maybe there's another way. Maybe we haven't addressed, maybe I've been seeing a therapist and nothing's helping. Well, maybe I really need to change how I eat. And certainly if you're a young person, I would encourage parents, this makes a big difference. So
I remember when I mentioned, and this was in my high carb eating days, but when I mentioned to my, I think, GP, it was a family doctor at the time, that I'm going to start exercising. I didn't have I never had excess weight, but I thought, okay, that was worth mentioning. So I remember one of the things she said to me was, okay, so before you go for a jog or a run or whatever, so make sure you eat a banana. Slow release sort of carb. And I never did. I didn't take up exercise, of course, but I never ate the banana either. So I'm pleased about that, because I started weightlifting actually only last year. And now that I have a CGM and a pump and the right knowledge, I'm well equipped to actually take care of my own health. But it's a sad reality. There are many, many people like me who reach out to me and say, how do you address that? Or what do you do as type 1s? We're kind of left without the right guidance. And there are very few good sources of information specifically for type 1s that obviously promote low carbohydrate nutrition and exercise and address it in a good sort of doable way. Do you have any type 1 diabetics in your sort of circle? And have you ever had to coach a type 1 diabetic?
I haven't personally coached a type 1 diabetic. My nephew, my second oldest sister's son, is a type 1 diabetic. So certainly, it's really interesting to follow his blood sugars, and my two oldest sisters are MDs. They're both very familiar with low carbohydrate nutrition. And Liam is his name, my nephew. He certainly eats a little bit more freely and doesn't follow a very low carbohydrate diet. But we notice when he follows a higher fat, we really prioritize fat. When that kid eats, especially when he's staying at Aunt Michelle and Aunt Green's house, he is loading up on fat at night. There is if he has pizza before he goes to bed, his blood sugars will be a nightmare. They will be through the roof, So what I have found, in the type 1 diabetics that I've talked to, like Dr. Stephen Hussey, is often they are not able to completely get off insulin with like a low carbohydrate diet because, once again, you don't have a functioning pancreas, but they are able to vastly reduce the amount of insulin they use. And just like I use carbohydrates very strategically, potentially in my training, if you are doing some, intense, like Liam, my nephew does soccer. So, he uses carbohydrates very strategically. He's not chugging Gatorade on the sideline or whatever, but he's monitoring it. He's having maybe some fruit slices and some other things. And so, but once again, in his diet, really prioritize protein and fat. He's not getting up and eating a bowl of cereal. He's not having pasta for lunch. He's having much higher, and it can be hard because he's a kid and all the kids around him are eating a lot of, maybe less than ideal things. But he also knows, he's very smart. He knows I don't feel good, after I eat these things, or my blood sugar might get kind of low. So type 1 certainly have a few extra challenges to work with. And I really wish there were better resources, because I think if you started with that foundation of that higher fat, higher animal-based protein diet, and then you use potentially carbohydrates around maybe really intense activity, you would see A1Cs, really low. The type 1 diabetic I feature in my book, her A1C, it says she's not even diabetic. It's in the normal range. And of course, her doctor's like, I guess just keep doing what you're doing, because they don't know either. They don't have good information on low carbohydrate diets. Some doctors do. There's some fantastic doctors out there, but it's not something that's very well taught.
That's what I was told. Keep doing what you're doing. You're doing well.
Yeah. That's what my doctor told me. It's like, well, yeah, it was interesting. I remember the first time I had labs after I just started, probably a year after my low carb diet. She even, when she wrote me back, she made a note that my LDL was high, but she's like, I know you're not worried about that. And she even said, you seem much happier. Somebody who sees me like once a year made notice that, wow, like your whole presence is different, so that's a huge thing for me. Just mood in general, like my outlook on life is so much different than it used to be.
Well, I obviously when I fed myself lots of carbs, I was vegetarian. I'd been vegetarian for 30 years. And by vegetarian, I mean I ate dairy and eggs, but I didn't understand nutrition at all. I didn't realize the importance of protein. Anyone, would tell me about protein, or you need, my mom doesn't understand nutrition either, but her common sense told her, that you need to eat meat. And I would just have the biggest arguments with her. Just don't interfere. No one needs to eat meat. I didn't even eat sufficient eggs. If there was an egg in the pastry, for example, that would be it. So it was last year, actually, on my birthday, exactly now, 13 months ago, I decided to introduce meat for the first time into my diet. I was talking to Dr. Sean Baker just last week, and I was telling him how difficult it was to transition into meat eating after being vegetarian for so long. And one of the toughest things for me was actually the whole process of chewing.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
It was a completely different experience, putting a piece of steak in my mouth and having to chew it. I still struggle. 13 months on, I'm still struggling. So I have to cut the steak in tiny, tiny pieces, etc. But I am eating meat. So my diet now is ketovore. And I was going to say about blood sugar fluctuations. So I am not getting the blood sugar fluctuations. My LDL, like yours, has gone up from my vegetarian carb eating days to my now ketovore diet. But I'm not particularly worried about the...
No, we're going to have really good studies. Dr. Dave Feldman's hyper responder study will help show. But, I wrote about that extensively in my book, just because everyone loses their mind about LDL and wants to put people on statins. But, we know now, we have so much data that the higher LDL, the less risk of infection you have, the less risk of dying. And it's so funny because one of the issues with LDL is we find it in occluded arteries, right? We find it like if you have a plaque built up in your artery, we see LDL. So doctors and scientists just, said, oh, LDLs in arteries, high LDL gets stuck, bad. But if you, once again, common sense, take a step back. Okay, so the Inuit Eskimos, all they eat is well blubber and their LDL is through the roof and they have zero heart disease, none, no cancer. We introduce westernized foods into the Inuit, pasta, sugar, heart disease goes through the roof. And now we just have extensive studies that something has to happen in that artery for LDL to get stuck. So it doesn't just get stuck on its own. It goes through just fine. It has a job to do. So what happens? There has to be some kind of inflammation or damage. What causes inflammation and damage in your arteries? High blood sugar over time. That's why diabetics, type 2 diabetics specifically, have a 2 to 4-fold risk of getting, heart disease. It's not the fat, it's the sugar. It's those processed carbohydrates over time, and unfortunately, because of that, people are afraid to eat meat. We eat meat throughout all of evolution. The human race would not exist if we didn't eat meat, and I hear you. It can be a very hard transition for people who aren't used to it. I actually, because of my very high carbohydrate diet, I did eat meat, but very much damaged my teeth, so, I'm not super old, but I can't eat super tough stuff, so for us, we do a lot of ground beef, we do some salmon, some softer type foods. But yeah, it is animal protein, in my opinion, specifically those ruminant animals, the beef, bison, lamb, is the best thing you can do for your body and your brain, because it's not just protein. I mean, if you take tofu and you take ground beef, even if they have the same amount of quote unquote protein, it's, one is absorbed so much better. The beef is absorbed, but beef also has iron, thiamine, some folic acid, it's higher in liver, all kinds of acids and cofactors, carnitine, taurine, creatine, all the things that cause the human body to work well. This is what we're designed to eat. Most people intuitively know that different species eat differently. I have a dog, I have a tortoise. Guess what? We feed them very differently. If I fed our dog what we feed the tortoise, the dog would probably die. The tortoise eats a lot of lettuce, vice versa. But humans have a species-specific diet. We are very adaptable in that, we can survive off all kinds of nonsense. There's studies of people losing weight just eating Twinkies. But what does that do to your body and your brain? If you want to thrive, if you want to have incredible physical and mental health, I mean, this way of eating took me from an anxious, broken person who couldn't run a mile to a happy author who just ran 62 miles and kicked the field's ass, you know? So I'm unapologetic about this way of eating. And I'm discouraged and disgusted, to be honest with you, about people who say that meat will kill you or meat is bad for the planet. That's total nonsense. You know, regenerative agriculture, raising animals in a way that is humane, that goes with the life cycle, you know, the rain cycle, actually sequesters carbon into the soil. It's actually good for the environment. You know what's bad for the environment? Monocropping. your soy and your kale and your quinoa, you know what kills animals? Soy. It's amazing how many animals die for vegans, and they're very strange bunch. This oh, we don't eat animals. Well, your tofu is killing a bunch of rabbits, you know. So anyway, we could go off down a rabbit hole with that. But the point being that I've always said too, like, I don't have any stock in what other people eat. If they're eating a certain way and they're healthy and they're happy, that's great. But I think everybody needs to know what science says. What my clinical experience, groups of doctors and dietitians, when we've seen healing, we need to talk about it.
Yeah. Let me add here that, yes, I was vegetarian, and I even had intermittent sort of periods of veganism because I thought I would be healthier if I just cut out the dairy as well. And but I did not raise my child as a vegan or vegetarian. I thought that was my choice, entirely my choice, even though I didn't understand nutrition. But for me, morally, it just did not seem right to force a certain way of eating onto my child. So I always cooked meat for the family, even though I disliked doing it, but I'm still not very friendly with it, but I am eating it. So the ketovore diet, we mentioned it. So I am on a ketovore diet, and so are you now. What does it sort of involve?
Oh, sure. I think it can.
A typical plate look like?
Yeah, I think it can look different for different people. I have found that I do better with a little bit higher protein, not particularly, ketogenic diets tend to be 60 to 70% fat. But for an example, a meal would be like you'd have 6 to 8 ounces of salmon or a higher fat steak, ground beef, maybe 4 or 5 eggs, cooked in butter, tallow, ghee. If you eat vegetables, you certainly could have any non-starchy vegetables. You could have them cooked. We often will do some carrots or some mushrooms cooked in ghee. And then, if you are having small amounts of carbohydrates, I always just tell people, eat what you enjoy, what settles with your system. Some people find that, small amounts of like a sweet potato, some fresh seasonal fruit does really well. I don't eat much fruit. I don't really like potatoes or sweet potatoes. Certainly when I'm running, I'll do a little bit of rice. We do some long fermented sourdough bread. But all of my meals are very high in butter. Gosh, what else? Oh, I do, some organ meats. I think, certainly liver, kidney, heart. We get a cow share, so they give us free liver, like a ton of, because nobody wants it. One of the most nutrient dense foods, right? So we do some liver. But yeah, when you're looking at a ketovore diet, that basically is, very high fat, part protein and very minimal carbohydrates.
I have to say, I've done carb counting pretty much all my life. Well, from the moment it became a thing for us to carb count and match the insulin to the carbs. But I avoid counting protein and fat. I eat foods in their natural form as much as I can. But then I'm not an athlete, so I'm not really measuring my performance in that respect. What I'm going to eat, if anyone is interested today, after we finish the recording, it's going to be my one meal of the day. I might have a second meal later on, but it's ground beef, which I've already cooked yesterday. So I have it in the fridge, and I'm going to have eggs with it, maybe a small avocado. Avocados are local here. So I'm recording this from Mexico now. So they're local. So I just feel sort of bad to see them going literally rotting in
that's
grocery
unfortunate.
stores.
Yeah.
If they're going to go to the bin, I think, oh no, I've got to eat, I've got to. And they're very cheap as well. So I do tend to just buy vegetables which are local, and even sort of meat which is local, which brings us to the regenerative farming. Do you try to sort of buy local produce when you're doing your shopping?
Yeah, I'm very fortunate that, we had connected with a local farmer, and we, get a cow share. We found we're eating a lot more ground beef than some of the other cuts. So when we do that, we actually have a farmer's market in our city where farms just come, and we've connected with a farm called Windy River Farm. And we buy, I'm usually buying, 16 to 32 pounds of ground beef at a time. And yeah, I think that's the best thing you can do if you want to support the planet. Invest in the farmers, invest in the people that are, raising their animals in a humane, regenerative way. You're supporting that, you're supporting the land, you're supporting their family. So that's what we do. Most of our we don't do I guess it's funny. I guess we do buy a lot of produce, but mostly for the tortoise. She eats a lot of produce. But yeah, we find, I grow some of what we eat. I've grown some carrots. But yeah, we don't do a ton of produce just for us. We'll certainly do some seasonal fruits and things. Like we'll get at the farmer's market. My wife makes some long fermented sourdough that, as an athlete, I use to help fuel my activity. But most of, say probably 90% of our meat comes from farmers, regenerative ag.
You've got to give me the sourdough recipe.
Oh yeah, I will. I'll send it to you. It's pretty fabulous.
Yeah, I'll try it too. So I want to go back to the CGM experiment, and you tried to monitor your blood sugars, wearing the CGM, eating different foods which you wouldn't normally eat. Mm-hmm. I know you had to have donuts just to see what it will do to your blood sugars. Let's talk about that. That really is fascinating for me, because here's a non-diabetic. Mm-hmm. Not diabetic, but just non-diabetic, healthy, fit person who's having these sort of blood sugar rises up to diabetic range, and that cannot be normal. Tell us about the raw milk experiment, the banana experiment, and the donut. I think donut is also fascinating.
Yeah. So banana, I mean, that one, not a super shock, right? That, something that's very high. And well, it is interesting because there's a misconception that fruit is just fructose. Like, oh, it's fructose, it's good for you, it's not going to cause a rise in blood sugar. Like, are you sure? No, fruit certainly has different types of sugar. Most fruits are, a combination of fructose and glucose. And yeah, having a banana certainly caused a rise in blood sugar. Gosh, I did this a while ago. You have to probably remind me, but if I recall, the raw milk was pretty stable. Like it wasn't a very big rise. And I'm somebody who, we're very fortunate. We actually have access to raw milk. It's in a local supermarket, but I don't drink a whole lot of it. It's delicious, but it doesn't seem like it settles well with my stomach. I lean towards heavy creams and raw cheeses and things if I'm going to do that. And yeah, the donut, it was interesting. I would have thought that the donut would have been like the highest possible one, and it wasn't. It wasn't, it was interesting that things like fruits and rices and things like that actually caused more intense blood sugar spikes, and you could certainly argue and say like, oh, well, donut has fat or whatever. But, most people, if you said like, oh, if you ask them which one's going to cause the highest spike, they'd say, oh, donut's terrible for you. Oh, banana's good for you. We should eat bananas. But in reality, kind of the take-home message of that experiment was carbohydrates, regardless of their form, are going to cause a rise in blood sugar. And so if you are somebody who's pre-diabetic or diabetic, type 2 diabetes, or has some type of, obesity or insulin resistance, you need to really consider, or I would highly recommend you consider reducing all carbohydrates. I can't tell you how many type 2 diabetics I saw in the hospital that were like, oh, I only eat fruit and rice and all these healthy carbs. It's like, that does the same thing. It doesn't matter if it's in a cookie or an apple, they all break down to sugar. So that was, that's kind of a good lesson for people that, we really, if I could change the world, every human would start with just eating meat and fat. Let's get used to eating these real foods again. And also, unfortunately, we eat so many processed foods. We're so used to that sweet taste. People are getting blood sugar and dopamine responses, like, not just once or twice a day, but like, 10 times a day. So it's not a healthy, sustainable thing to do. And that's why we're seeing so many people, have all kinds of issues. And it's not just diabetes. We have evidence too that Alzheimer's is another disease. They're starting to call it type 3 diabetes. Has to do with insulin resistance potentially in the brain. So
what would you say to someone who says, well, this sort of eating meat-based diet isn't sustainable? No one can stick to that. Don't you ever miss cookies and all the processed sort of, well, biscuits we'd call them, but I think it's cookies there. Or...
Yeah. Well, I always say I'm an adult. I get to do whatever I want at any time I want. I went into this saying like, let's see, because I knew one thing. I knew my health was really bad. I would encourage anybody to do this if you're considering making a change. I sat with myself, and I just call it radical honesty. This isn't like, I suck. No, this is like, my health is really bad. My anxiety is so bad that I'm considering self-injury. I can no longer run, which is something that I love to do. I hate my job. And so for me, it was like, can this potentially help me? I had no idea it was going to change my life, but I thought, well, maybe this will make my muscle pain better. Maybe this will give me a little more energy, And so for me, it's like, let's see. And I feel so much better now than I did. You literally couldn't pay me. You could say, Michelle, I will give you $1 million. You can buy off your house. You can pay off your student loans. You can take your wife on that vacation you've been promising her. If you will eat a carbohydrate diet for the next 10 years, and I tell you to go kick rocks, like, and I promise you, I could use the money, but everything has changed. I have my life back. I am we think that these moments of eating food are going to bring us so much joy. Like, oh, I love sugar. I love donuts. I would also ask you, do you really feel good? Do you feel joy? Maybe for like 30 seconds, but my life is so full of joy. And this meat is delicious. I get to eat steak and butter. I get to eat cheese. I get to eat all these things that contribute to my health and my life. And then I get to move on. Food should not be something that you like eat and that you're obsessing about, or you get dizzy, shaky, causes you to be fat and diabetic. That's a restrictive life. My life is freaking awesome. And so I would encourage people just to really think about it in a different light. Like, how amazing could your life be if you slept well, if you and your partner now weren't arguing, if you weren't angry, if you had energy, if you weren't in pain, everything in your life can be so different by how you feed your body. So I have no interest in trying to convince someone to change if they're not ready or if they don't want to. I just, I knew I couldn't be silent when my health shifted so powerfully. And so, everything has changed in my life. So yeah. So if you want to think that or anybody wants to think it's restrictive or unsustainable, we also have ample case studies of people eating ketogenic diets for decades. I mean, that if you want to just go back to evolution, that's how we ate. But certainly even now, and yes, can it be harder? Yes. You're going to have to pack your own food. You're going to have to do some cooking. But once again, like I told you, you couldn't pay me to change how I eat.
Mm-hmm. And I think once you get used to it, the sort of that constant hunger vanishes. Mm-hmm. And you could go, if I'm going on a long drive, I don't even bother packing. I just take my glucose tabs just in case, because as a type 1 diabetic, we have to sort of rescue a hypo when a hypo hits us. But I don't have those moments anymore. I don't even feel hungry. We could go on a long ride without filling the boot of the car with chips, crisps for us in the UK, and all that junk. You don't need to eat and snack constantly because you have enough nutrition. Your body's is adapted to burning fat. Do you agree?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, we all, even super lean people. So, I'm about probably 10 to 12% body fat. I have 50 to 70,000 calories of stored body fat. But when we eat, every time you have carbohydrates, you have chips, crisps, cookies, even fruit, apple, it's very powerful. Insulin is a powerful hormone. It will shut off your body's ability to burn fat for fuel. And so you have to keep eating those carbohydrates because you're no longer tapping into your own body fat. That's why you're hungry every 2 to 3 hours. And it's brilliant marketing. I mean, all these food companies are making so much money off people. We're literally setting you up to fail, setting you up to have to keep eating all those carbohydrates. But when you can burn your own body fat for fuel, not only is your energy very stable, like you said, you're not hungry, you're not getting the release of like ghrelin, like some of those hunger hormones, your blood sugar is not going too low, and you tend to be able to function and recover better. You know, when I was a high carbohydrate athlete, if I ran 18 or 20 miles, I was out for the rest of the day, maybe the weekend. I mean, now I run 25 miles and come back and do it the next day. You know, sometimes my wife makes me work in the yard later, you know, so it changes everything. You know, there's a lot of inflammation and oxidation that comes in when you're eating a lot of sugar and highly processed carbohydrates too. So you're removing that inflammation, you're removing those blood sugar spikes and crashes, you're removing the cortisol and other stress hormones that come when you're spiking and crashing your blood sugar. So yes, it is a very healthy and sustainable way to live. And, you know, unfortunately, there's just so many people that have so many misconceptions. You know, if you bring it up, you're going to have someone tell you you're going to die of heart disease, or keto is bad, or it's not sustainable. So, you know, I always tell people, just say, all right, we'll see. That's what I always say. Okay, we'll see. You know, I'm doing all right. I'm going to just keep doing my thing.
I've been able to sustain it.
Good for you. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so have thousands of people. And, you know, we're not alone. If you guys, you know, there's so many examples on social media, and, you know, you can read obviously Dr. Sean Baker, you know, Paul Saladino, or some big names, but there's thousands of us that have been eating this way and have been able to change. And there's clinical trials. You know, we can reduce plasma glucose and increase insulin sensitivity in less than 2 weeks with a low carb diet, you know, so this is science-based and it is safe and sustainable.
Michelle, so what does the dietitian's dilemma cover? Obviously, I mean, it is what a dilemma. I mean, I don't know how you address that. I mean, you literally have to come out of the field, right?
Yeah,
because you can't function there and do your own thing. You have to.
Yes, I have to practice as a nutritionist, even though I'm a registered dietitian. So yeah, you know, it's my story. It's what it was like having anorexia, going through, you know, being told you're going to die. It's the first chapter is pretty intense, and I try to be pretty raw and vulnerable because I know I've been there. I've been to hell and back. It's a very hard and scary journey. And then I wanted to speak about 5 disease states that I saw quite a bit in the hospital. And I felt like the evidence really showed how a low carbohydrate diet can help. So I talk about type 2 diabetes, heart disease, sarcopenia, mental disorders, including major depression, anxiety, and eating disorders. Then I have a whole chapter on where this then guidelines came from, because it's pretty bizarre. And then, you know, I have a getting started chapter. I have a chapter about my running. I was surprised how many people were curious about endurance running. So I was like, all right, we'll include that. And yeah, let me just wrap it up. There's 25 testimonies. There's 180 cited articles. And, you know, it's just my gift of gratitude back to anybody who's interested, or anybody who's like, gosh, I really want to try this, but I don't know. Does it make sense? So I wanted it to, you know, obviously have the science, but I wanted it to be very readable and relatable.
Michelle, where can people buy the book?
So it's on Amazon. You know, I know it's people, you can get the paperback book on Amazon. I also have an ebook and an Audible that I read on Amazon. You know, you can follow me on, you know, Instagram at Run Eat Meat Repeat. I like to post videos on there. Michelle Hurn RD on Twitter, and the dietitiansdilemma.net is my website. I'll put all the links below in the show notes. Thank you. I appreciate that. I think you covered so much. That was great.
Covered everything. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, I feel like we could probably talk for days about all kinds of different stuff, but that was good. That was a lot. Yeah, sorry for bringing my own things. No, I think your own story is helpful, and I think type 1. I think we need more type 1 people to talk about low carb diets, because it's still, you know, is as much as they hate it for a general population, they're like, oh, type 1's gonna die. So I think I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you so much for your time. You're welcome. Appreciate it. And I'm gonna follow you on Instagram as well. Okay, well, you have a good day. Thank you. And thank you again. You're welcome. Have a good one.